Hello guys, what's up? In this video I'm going to show you how I painted and weathered the Cobblestone street diorama for my recent Sliabh Mban project. Let's get started right away, shall we? The primer I chose is Alclad 2 black primer with microfiller, which I applied unthinned at around 20 psi with my trusty Badger. This is a very toxic primer, which as the name indicates has filler particles. So respirator and an extractor booth are a must if you decide to use it. It is pretty much the only non-acrylic paint that clogs up my airbrush. However, it does create a very tough coat and has excellent adherence. While you watch me prime this, let me tell you a bit more about this diorama. It's a 1/35th scale scenic base from the German company RT Diorama, made from some kind of plaster. It has an amazing level of detail, but it's porous and a bit fragile. At only 13 euros though, it's an excellent value. Unfortunately, it did arrive broken, but I really don't think that's the company's fault. In order to give it more stability before I glued it back together, I added EPS foam as a backing, and I filled any gaps with green stuff. The porous nature of both the plaster and the foam was another reason why I wanted to use the strongest primer in my arsenal. A rattle can primer with microfiller would also work nicely and allow you to save time. In any case, I would definitely recommend RT Diorama products despite the breakage, and bear in mind that if you order directly from them, you can get all their dioramas in ceramic instead of plaster, which is more expensive but probably well worth it. Going back to the priming process itself, I should note that I waited 24 hours after priming in order to play it safe. I really wouldn't wait any less than that. As you can see, I went with my beloved Tamiya XF paints in this case. I just knew that I wanted to use a lacquer, or a semi-lacquer in this case, in order to have an easy time spraying this rather huge base. As you can see, this paint goes on super smooth, and I literally didn't have to clean the tip even once during the entire process, despite spraying almost continuously. The choice of color was important in that it had to be light enough to give contrast with the dark, bluish gray of the vehicle, while still being somewhat faithful to the reference pictures of cobblestone streets of Dublin that I had obsessively studied for weeks. The porosity of the material did mean that the base seemingly drank the paint up like crazy, requiring far more passes with the airbrush than I'm used to doing. As you can see, this made me gradually go more trigger happy with the airbrush. All I needed in any case was a uniform base, and at this stage I was confident that I had achieved that. Having let the paint dry for about half an hour, I applied some masking tape and got ready to do my secondary color for the sidewalk. In this case I went with Steingrau from AK Real Colors, with their own thinner. Now for the paint nerds among you, let me tell you that this is kind of the opposite route to the previous one with Tamiya. Tamiya XF paints, as I've said in the past, are alcohol-based acrylics, so they're kind of in between water-based acrylics and lacquers in terms of their qualities. By adding lacquer thinner, however, we make them move towards the lacquer end of the spectrum, so less dry tip, more transparent, etc. AK Real Colors, on the other hand, are actual lacquers, but the associated thinner is much weaker than the Tamiya lacquer thinner. This AK High Compatibility thinner is based on propylene glycol methyl ether, or PGME for short. That was quite a mouthful. This is flammable, but it has low toxicity. The Tamiya thinner, yeah, I think it's highly toxic. Is this relevant to the video? Well, no, but I've been meaning to share this with you for a while, so this has given me the right excuse. By the way, do you have to use the AK thinner with AK paints or Tamiya thinner with Tamiya paints? Not at all, that's just an urban myth. To be honest, I just switch to the AK one normally when I need to use chipping fluid, as it does make the paint react with it. Otherwise, whatever floats your boat. So finally, time for some proper weathering techniques. This is the part where I had the most fun, and I'm actually quite happy with the results that I got. Looking at reference pictures, it was clear that cobblestones tend to have many different colors and tones. My overall goal was to make the diorama interesting and to have some sense of verisimilitude. The key here would be to avoid symmetry, as that would immediately break what in literature we know as the suspension of disbelief, immersion in other words. So with that in mind, I used a variety of oil brushers and tried really hard not to apply the little dots in any symmetrical pattern. Let me tell you, for someone as OCD-like as me, purposely and methodically avoiding symmetry is pretty darn hard. I have edited quite a bit here, not only the parts where I'm sticking my head in front of the camera, not a pretty sight, but also the many times when I'm hesitating because I'm trying to think where not to place the next dot. In terms of technique, the only things to bear in mind are that I'm using a makeup brush and a stippling motion in order to blend the oils. Most of the time the brush was completely dry, in fact. Only when some of the dots were a bit overpowering, like with the white ones, did I dampen the brush slightly with thinner. This was quite a long process, but it was really relaxing. Now I know this is quite a long segment, but I think I'm going to shut up now and let you enjoy the music and this almost hypnotic technique. The result may look a bit garish along the way, but I knew that the next few steps would really tone things down, so I was confident that things would work out well. Time for an enamel wash. For this I used Ammo Dark Wash, which is a sort of blackish green. As usual, I added some thinner to the mix in order to improve the capillary action. It's important to note that I varnished the whole thing with Tamiya Clear prior to this step. No matter what varnish you use, I would definitely apply a gloss varnish before this step. As you can see, I was too conservative with the amount of wash that I was applying initially, which meant that it took me ages to finish this huge base. Sometimes there is such a thing as being too careful. The thing is, I'm so used to applying a delicate pin washing on vehicles that doing the sort of aggressive and carefree application that this really called for felt really alien to me. Well, another lesson learned, I guess. As you can see, I gave most parts a second pass because of the above, and I went heavier this time around. After I was done, I let the whole thing dry for around 3 hours. So this time I went for an alternative blending technique, using a makeup sponge instead of a brush. This feels a bit more indiscriminate, but you can do it dry, and you can also yield good results, particularly with raised surfaces like the cobblestones. As you can see, this worked fairly well. The wash remained in all the recessed areas and was not completely removed from the details either, just kind of toned down. This increased subtlety compared to the way that I normally do the blending prompted me to check out Ammo's new dedicated blending sponges, which I'll be showing you soon. Here you can see the 3 pigments that I planned on using. The one on the right, which is a concrete color, I ended up discarding, as it clearly wouldn't have stood out enough. As you have seen me do on other occasions, I used a makeup brush and I sort of sprinkled the pigment onto the base. The same as with the oils, I tried my best to avoid symmetry. Trust me, being deliberately chaotic is quite hard. After that, I switched to a different makeup brush and I started to stipple the pigments. Even though the brown patches were quite exaggerated at this stage, I was confident that I would eventually get the effect that I had envisaged. For that purpose, I got the sponge out again, this time to blend the pigments. As you can see, this worked well and made the brown patches more diffuse. After a while, I took a good look at the base to see whether I was ready to move on or not. It was still looking a bit too clean, so I thought let's give it another round of dirt. As soon as I started to apply some more Europe earth, I realized that I had made the right call. I knew that horse carriages were common in 1920s Dublin, and also that most country roads in the area would have been macadam roads at best. By the way, macadam is a type of road that is better than a dirt road, but it's not quite asphalt. Anyway, therefore I reasoned cobble streets must have been quite dirty at the time. Long-winded digressions aside, I decided to remove the excess pigment with my airbrush, which worked quite well, and in order to secure everything in place, I let everything dry overnight, and then I applied a generous coating of Tamiya Flat Clear. I always forget to record something, and this couldn't be an exception. In this case, it was the puddles, which I'm actually quite proud of. In any case, there isn't much mystery to it. I just used UV resin from Green Stuff World mixed with a couple of drops of strong wash from Army Painter. This is in fact one of the few remaining uses that I have for my acrylic washes. So anyway, what are my conclusions tonight? What lessons could I impart? Well, first of all, that diorama bases like this one are a lot of fun. As a matter of fact, I enjoyed this a lot more than I did the actual vehicle. Zero stress, techniques that are fun and relaxing, and solid results. Secondly, I would wholeheartedly recommend RT diorama products to you, regardless of whether the base arrived broken or not, which is surely not the company's fault. The level of detail is exquisite, and you should see their buildings. They're truly amazing. And last but not least, I would encourage you all to pick up something different to build and paint in the next few weeks. As a change of pace, I hadn't done anything quite like this since I painted the base for my Warhound Titan a year ago, and it was quite an eye-opener for me. I have since bought a pretty huge flag emplacement diorama, sort of bunker, and I'm quite excited to paint it. Try new genres, guys. Well, that's all I have for now. Thank you for your support, and see you around on Patreon.